Outages in a town outside Havana soon spread across the island as frustrations over the government's handling of food shortages, lack of medicines, inflation and the coronavirus pandemic boiled over. Throughout 6 decades of communist rule, the US has kept up its punishing economic embargo on the island. And now, in the wake of the protests, the Biden administration has imposed new sanctions in response to the government's crackdown on protesters. With human rights groups saying hundreds of protesters are still in jail or have received summary trials, the government is now facing the biggest challenge of the post-Castro era. From Havana, our Latin America correspondent Will Grant reports. That was excellent.
Food in Cuba's dire shortages, many start before dawn. Shoppers queue from the small hours outside this state-run food store, hopeful of finding much-needed basic goods. As a government official notes down their ID numbers so they can only visit once a day, Cubans have coped without letting their complaints become too loud or forceful. At least they did until the 11th of July. When the moment of social uprising came, it was like no other under the Cuban Revolution. Fidel Castro faced down a large demonstration in 1994, but that was only in Havana. This time, the protests were all being live-streamed and quickly spread across the island. For years, the Cuban government has described those who speak against it as counter-revolutionary. But it's far harder to paint these people as somehow funded by Washington or incited by Miami. Most were ordinary people who'd simply snapped.
A combination of shortages of basic goods, long electricity blackouts, worsening inflation, the coronavirus pandemic and the unending US economic embargo have been brutal on Cubans. It's only the government's iron grip over the freedom of assembly that has kept a lid on things until now. The question is, of course, whether the protests will be enough to effect meaningful change on the island.
It has already shifted attitudes among many young people. 24-year-old Cuban actor Daniel Triana, who protested that day, says his generation are fast losing their fear of authority.
We have seen things that we couldn't imagine a few years ago. Yes, people are awakening in Cuba, and that awakening is thanks most of all to the internet.
Among those unthinkable moments has been a series of online videos by some Cuban doctors denouncing conditions in the island's overwhelmed hospitals. Such criticism from within one of the pillars of the Cuban Revolution, its healthcare system, is rare and brave. The government, which last week introduced a draconian new social media law, accuses its outspoken critics of provocation.
If demanding our right as Cubans, our civil rights, is a provocation, if sitting pacifically in front of the building that is supposed to represent all of the Cuban is a provocation, well, we are provokers, But they call us provokers and they call what we do provocation because they are not willing to dialogue with us. They are not willing to accept that is an authentic opposition in Cuba.
Daniel was detained for 24 hours and then released. Others, however, weren't so lucky. Human rights groups say hundreds remain in jail and have been denied basic legal rights, such as speaking to a lawyer. They include Naika Santana's 14-year-old son, Christopher, arrested shortly after the protest for throwing a stone. She shows me medical documents that prove he has the mental capacity of a boy around half his age. Naika still hasn't been able to see him and is growing increasingly desperate. It hurts me, she says. He's just a child with mental health problems. He really doesn't comprehend what's happening. The Cuban government has refused to comment on individual cases, but denies the broader accusation that detainees are being mistreated or given arbitrary trials. Beyond the politics of the protests, plenty of people were prompted to the streets by their urgent economic needs. The island's centrally managed economy is crumbling. The sugar industry is stagnant, Soviet-era equipment lying idle. And amid the coronavirus pandemic, tourism, a vital source of foreign exchange, is at a standstill. It will take years for the Cuban economy to get back to where it was. The government recently relaxed the rules on private enterprise, like small-scale restaurants, and Cuban entrepreneurs can now legally own medium-sized businesses. Some see a glimmer of hope in that decision.
I think this is a win-win situation for everybody. And I personally believe that these changes are not exactly a result of what happened on July 11, because the government has been working on this for several months during these years. But maybe July 11 helped or was the final push.
But most young Cubans are hungry for greater, faster changes. The energy and sense of possibility of the Obama-era thaw, when the island seemed to finally be looking outwards, has long been lost. Even top Cuban government officials admit that they've not done enough to bring the aging revolutionary model into the 21st century.
When you are in a war, the noise of the cannons doesn't let you hear the voice of the people that you have around. And that's what has been happening for many years in Cuba. Let us live in peace. Let us work out our own problems. Let us build the country that we want to build without any foreign interference, without any foreign pressure, without any power trying to meddle with our problems in Cuba.
Certainly, the Biden administration is keeping up the pressure, showing no sign of easing the Trump administration's harshest rules on Cuba, nor lifting the decades-long economic embargo.
Surely, though, you can see the contradiction of speaking about helping the Cuban people while those sanctions are still in place. I mean, there is no real greater help to the Cuban people than easing those economic sanctions that are causing so much pain and have done for so long.
The embargo allows for certain exceptions under the embargo for the delivery of humanitarian assistance, for example. And one thing that we are actively trying to do is to make sure that humanitarian actors, faith-based groups, and others know that those exemptions exist.
The old guard of revolutionaries in Cuba have always thrived in a crisis, and the island's leadership may well overcome this current one too. Certainly they have the might and experience to do so. But inspiring a new generation of revolutionaries is an altogether different prospect, and it will take more than the tired and overused slogans of the past to persuade Cuba's young people that the answers they seek can still be found in communism, especially after such heavy-handed intolerance of any other viewpoint about Cuba's future direction.
In what is now Cuba's biggest crisis since the years immediately after the Cold War, many young people see leaving Cuba as their only choice. Others are left hoping that lasting change is on the horizon and will reach them before it's too late.
That report from Will Grant. Well, earlier I spoke to the Director General of U.S. Affairs, Carlos Fernando de Cosio, a minister in the Cuban government. As you will see, it was from a very windy Havana. I began by asking him how many people the government are currently holding in jail following the July protests.
Certainly not 1,000. I don't know how many people. We have had cases that have been prosecuted, around 23, with 60-something people that have been accused, some of which have already been had results in their trial, but there's not hundreds of people in jail, nor thousands, of course.
Amnesty International say the people that are being sentenced to years in jail haven't seen lawyers and haven't had a fair trial.
Everybody has had a fair trial.
Has everybody seen lawyers?
Everybody has had access to a lawyer. There has been a great campaign of disinformation about Cuba, trying to distort reality with fake news, but everybody has had an access to lawyers. It's part of the Cuban criminal law for people to have access to lawyers.
And what are the charges that were brought against people? What have they been sentenced for?
Many people, many cases are different, but there have people who have vandalized, destroyed property, have burned police cars, have attacked clinics. Those are the people that have had the most serious cases.
We have spoken to the mother of a 14-year-old boy who has the mental age of a 7-year-old who was lifted by the police for throwing stones. She hasn't been able to hear about him since. She's had no contact. She doesn't know where he is. How could that possibly happen?
Do you trust your source? I doubt what you're saying. No child has been disappeared. There's no person in Cuba that has not been heard of. Whoever says so is not telling the truth.
So this is an ordinary Cuban woman who has not seen her son, since the protest.
Have you checked your facts? Have you checked your facts? I can tell you nobody has been disappeared in Cuba.
The BBC has definitely checked its facts on this. Why won't you have dialogue with ordinary Cubans who are protesting about their conditions and about the conditions of the country and the conditions of politics?
We have dialogue? There's a constant dialogue in Cuba all the time. People protest all the time. People complain about the difficult situation in the country, about the economic hardship, about the pandemic, which is damaging every country in the world, including Cuba. With the difference that in Cuba, you have a superpower like the United States that has taken the pandemic as an ally in their policy of aggression against Cuba.
So if...
That's the main difference.
And you in turn are protesting about American sanctions. But then why, if you want American sanctions lifted, not increased, do you bring in a draconian law about social media? You're so afraid of hearing the views of ordinary Cubans and for ordinary Cubans to contact each other that you brought in a draconian law severely curtailing social media in Cuba.
Cuba has not cracked down social media. Cuba is not prohibiting internet. Internet exists in Cuba. It's developed and expanded basically by Cuban government programs. It's investing in social media. You can ask anyone in Cuba today and they have access to internet. I'm sure you can connect to them. What it's clear is that internet is being weaponized against Cuba. The US prohibits by law over 60 of the main websites and internet sites around the world for Cubans to have access to them, to have access for culture, for education, for communication with loved ones. They are prohibited because of US law. So we have to speak about it.
Minister, is it fair to say that if you can't take the people with you, the revolution is over, isn't it?
You're very right. That's why the majority of Cubans are with the revolution. And what happened on July 11th, the majority of the Cubans that went out in the street were in support of the revolution. We're not the ones that were against it. The great majority. You can be sure of that.
So you don't hold people without any justification. You don't hold people in jail. We heard about a young person, another young person had been held for 24 hours. You don't hold people without due process, access to lawyers, access to justice. That doesn't happen in Cuba?
No, we do not. And if you have any evidence, please put forward. If you have any evidence of one person disappeared in Cuba, if you have one clear evidence of someone who did not break the law that is imprisoned in Cuba today, people have been called for question, people have been come to the station to be interviewed, but people detained for not having broken the law, it hasn't happened, and people disappeared, not one whatsoever. If you have one example, I would invite the BBC to put one example forward.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister. And the allegations featured in the film have been put to the Cuban government. We have yet to receive a response. Charlie Watts, one of the greatest rock and roll drummers in the world, has died today at the age of 80. In some ways, he was the anchor of the Rolling Stones. He was understated and often seemed phlegmatic, but his drumming was key to such tracks as Paint It Black and the phenomenal Gimme Shelter.